Riverlands and Monsoon Sky. Before there are kingdoms with carved pillars and polished courts, before there are epics sung beside village fires, India begins as a landscape wide, patient, and old. Imagine the first light of day touching the Himalayas. Snowfields glow faintly like ash turning warm in a hearth. Below them, long rivers loosen from ice and stone and begin their slow work, carrying silt down into plains that stretch farther than the eye can hold. The air is cool at dawn, but you can already feel the promise of heat. And somewhere beyond the horizon over the ocean, the monsoon gathers its breath. This is the stage on which so many lives will pass tribes and traders, priests and poets, emperors and farmers, each one shaped by the same great rhythms, river flood and dry season mountain barrier, and open plain, coastal wind, and desert silence. If there is a single thread running through the history of India, it is that geography is never merely background. It is a quiet force steady as a heartbeat, guiding where people settle what they grow, how they worship, and how they imagine the world. To the north rise the Himalayas, not an impenetrable wall, but a vast protective presence. They shield much of the subcontinent from the coldest Central Asian winds, and they feed the rivers that make the plains fertile. Yet they also contain passes, high, narrow routes, where travelers, merchants, and armies can move slowly and perilously between worlds. Through these corridors, ideas and peoples will come and go over millennia, leaving traces in language, art, and belief. South of the mountains lies the Indo-Gangetic Plain, one of the great agricultural basins of the earth. It is a region of deep soil and wide horizons where the rivers change course over time, where a village can be built and rebuilt as the water shifts its path. To the northwest, the Indus and its tributaries spread into a complex network of channels, while farther east the Ganges and Yamuna flow through forests and fields, becoming not only lifelines but symbols, rivers that will be prayed to, sung to, and remembered as living presences. To the west is the Thar Desert, a land of sand and thorn scrub, a natural boundary that is not absolute but demanding. To the east, thick forests and hills lead toward the Brahmaputra Valley and the pathways into Southeast Asia. And in the center of the subcontinent, the Deccan Plateau rises older, rock-darker soil, in places long stretches of dry land, broken by river valleys that carve their own routes toward the sea. Then there are the coasts, the Arabian Sea to the west, the Bay of Bengal to the east. India is not only a land of inland plains and mountain passes, it is also a peninsula that reaches into the ocean like an open hand. Over time, sailors will learn the seasonal patterns of the monsoon winds, how they blow one way, then return, turning the sea into a reliable road. Spices, textiles, precious stones, and stories will move along these watery routes, linking Indian ports to Arabia, East Africa, the Roman world, and Southeast Asia. And above all of this is the monsoon itself. It is not merely weather. It is a system of life. Each year, clouds gather over warm seas and drift inland, releasing rain that can be gentle for days or violent in a single night. A good monsoon means harvest security and festivals. A failed one can mean hunger and migration. People learn to watch the sky with a kind of reverence because the sky decides so much, long before writing, long before the names of dynasties human beings lived in these lands. They made tools, tended fires, and followed game. Over tens of thousands of years, communities changed slowly and then more quickly as agriculture began to take root. In different regions, people learned to cultivate plants, to keep animals, to build more permanent settlements. The evidence is scattered stone tools, cave paintings, ancient hearths, and yet it is enough to tell a quiet truth. India's story is not one of sudden beginning. It is a long unfolding. By the 3rd millennium BCE, in the northwestern Riverlands, one of the world's earliest urban civilizations emerged, what we now call the Indus Valley civilization, or Harappan civilization, named for sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. If you picture those cities, do not imagine palaces towering above slums or walls crowded with statues of conquering kings. The surviving remains suggest something different: careful planning. Straight streets, standardized bricks, drainage systems, wells, and baths. There is a sense of practical order of civic life organized around water cleanliness and trade. At dawn in Mohenjo-Daro, you might have heard footsteps on packed earth and brick. You might have smelled grain stored in granaries and seen pottery carried to market. Craftspeople shaped beads from carnelian and drilled them with remarkable precision. Traders moved goods along river routes and perhaps across the sea. Seals carved with animals, bulls, elephants, strange composite creatures were pressed into clay to mark ownership and identity. Yet the script on these seals remains undeciphered, and so the inner voice of the civilization stays out of reach. We see the shape of their world, but we cannot fully hear their words. Still, the Indus cities tell us that India's earliest known urban life was connected, skilled, and outward-looking. These were not isolated settlements. They were part of a network that reached across regions, linking far-flung communities through commerce and shared standards. The people of this world lived with the rivers, but they were also vulnerable to them because rivers shift and climates change. Over time, the Indus system transformed. Scholars debate the precise causes: changes in rainfall patterns, the shifting of river courses, pressures on agriculture, the slow rearrangement of trade routes. Whatever the mix of reasons, the great urban centers declined and populations became more dispersed, moving into smaller towns and rural settlements. It is important to feel the pace of this, not a single dramatic fall, but a gradual rebalancing. Cities that once hummed with organized labor and long-distance exchange became quieter, their bricks weathering under sun and wind. And yet, decline is not disappearance. Elements of culture continue: craft traditions, regional practices, perhaps memories carried in stories. History in India, as elsewhere, is often like a river that divides into channels. One channel dries, another deepens, and the water keeps moving. As the 2nd millennium BCE progresses, new patterns appear in the northern plains. Languages, rituals, and social structures shift. The earliest Vedic texts, composed and transmitted orally for generations before being written down, offer a different kind of window into the past. They are not administrative records or king lists. They are hymns, prayers, reflections, and ritual formulas, voices shaped by pastoral life, by the movement of people, and herds by fire altars and the open sky. In these hymns you can feel a world where rivers matter, where dawn is a goddess, where the storm is alive with power. You can sense communities organizing themselves through kinship and ritual, negotiating status and duty, and slowly settling into more agrarian patterns as they move across the plains. This is not a single arrival or a single people replacing another. It is a long, complex, blending migrations and interactions, continuity and change woven into centuries. During this early period, the idea of dharma, a word that will grow vast with meaning, begins to take shape in the sense of order, right action, and cosmic balance. So does the centrality of sacrifice in Vedic religion, where fire becomes a bridge between human and divine. Over time, these ritual traditions will spark questions. What lies beneath the ritual? What is the self? What endures when everything changes? Those questions will one day be voiced in the Upanishads and later echoed in many schools of Indian philosophy. For now, though, it is enough to rest in the beginning, a subcontinent defined by water and wind, by mountains and monsoon, by openness and protection. India's story will not be a straight line. It will be many lines, kingdoms rising in one region, while forests remain dense in another, coastal trade flourishing while inland states struggle, new faiths emerging while older practices adapt and endure. And as the centuries move forward, the scattered settlements of the plains will begin to gather into larger realms. Iron will cut into forests, fields will expand, towns will grow at river crossings and trade routes. New forms of power will take shape, and with them new tensions and new possibilities, until the first great states of northern India begin to stand clearly in the historical light. The age of hymns and settling kingdoms. Even after the great brick cities of the Indus world fell quiet, the land did not fall silent. It simply changed its voice. In the early hours before the sun has fully risen, the plains of northern India can feel endless and hushed. Mist gathers low over riverbanks. Birds move through tall grasses. A thin line of smoke lifts from a hearth where a family has already woken, feeding a small fire that will cook grain-warm hands and light the first work of the day. In this world, the pace of life is measured not by stone walls and drainage channels, but by season's cattle and the steady migration of communities across open land. This is the age whose earliest echoes come to us through the Vedas, ancient hymns preserved not first on clay or copper, but in memory. For generations upon generations, voices carried these verses forward, teaching them with such precision that even the rhythm and the tones were guarded like treasure. When you listen to history here, it feels less like reading a chronicle and more like standing near a fire, while the night wind moves through trees, hearing words that link human life to sky storm, dawn, and flame. The earliest Vedic society was shaped by movement. Communities were organized in kin groups led by chiefs who depended on the loyalty of warriors and the wealth of herds. Cattle mattered deeply, not only as food and labor, but as status and security. A man's prosperity could be counted in animals, disputes and gifts, feasts and alliances, all carried the quiet weight of livestock. The world of these hymns is filled with images of chariots and horses of open spaces, and rivers crossed of rival groups competing for pasture and honor. Yet even in this mobile life there is a sense of order being carefully built. Ritual becomes a kind of architecture, something invisible but strong, a structure that holds the community together. The central ritual is sacrifice offered into fire. The fire crackles and breathes, turning ghee and grain into smoke that rises toward the sky. In the Vedic imagination, fire is not merely a tool, it is a messenger. The gods are present in wind and rain, in the sun's slow passage, in the sudden flash of lightning. The hymns speak to Indra, the stormbringer and warrior, to Agni the fire, to Varuna, the upholder of cosmic order, and to many other divine forms that feel like the living faces of nature itself. What is striking in this era is how closely religion and daily survival are intertwined. Rain is not a distant meteorological event, it is life. A successful sacrifice, a properly spoken hymn, an alliance sealed with gifts, a herd protected and increased. These are not separate categories. They belong to one world where human effort and cosmic rhythm are braided together. Over time, however, the rhythm of life begins to shift. Communities settle more firmly into the plains, especially along the Ganges and its tributaries. This is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual leaning toward permanence. People clear forests in slow stages, opening land for agriculture. Villages become more stable. The plow becomes a more common sight pulled by oxen through dark soil. Grain stores matter more than herds alone, and with settlement comes new kinds of power, because land can be controlled, taxed, measured, and defended. One of the great quiet revolutions of this period is iron. When iron tools spread more widely, forests that once resisted the axe begin to give way, fields expand. The capacity to grow surplus increases, and surplus changes everything. It supports specialists, craftspeople who make pottery and textiles, metal workers who shape tools and weapons, traders who carry goods between settlements, priests who devote their lives to ritual knowledge. It also supports leaders who can demand tribute and organize labor. In the Vedic texts and later traditions, society is often described through broad categories of role and status: priests, warriors, commoners, and servants, an early framework that will later be elaborated into more complex social structures. Yet it is important to understand these categories not as a single neatly designed system imposed at once, but as a shifting reality that hardened over time. In the beginning, identities were more fluid in practice than later legal and religious texts might suggest. What becomes clear, though, is that as agriculture and settled life deepen, hierarchy tends to deepen with it. A settled village needs rules: who has access to water, who owns which fields, who resolves disputes, and beyond the village, larger networks form. Small chiefdoms begin to grow into territorial states, known in later sources as Janapadas, footholds of power, anchored to specific regions. Their leaders do not merely lead raids or distribute gifts. They begin to collect revenue, to command standing forces, to build fortifications, and to define borders. If you travel in imagination through the Ganges plain at this time, you might see a patchwork of such territories. Some are still heavily forested, their settlements scattered. Others are more open, with cultivated land stretching outward and pathways worn by carts. At river crossings, market activity begins to thicken. Salt iron tools, grain, and cloth move from hand to hand. Simple coinage is not yet dominant everywhere, but exchange becomes more regular, and with trade comes contact between languages, customs, and beliefs. As these early states grow, competition intensifies. The old Vedic world of clan rivalry evolves into larger struggles for land and tribute. Chiefs begin to take on the aura of kingship. Ritual becomes even more tightly connected to power because a king's legitimacy can be announced through sacrifice, grand ceremonies that gather priests, nobles, and allies, displaying wealth and authority in a language everyone understands. The most famous of these, described later with elaborate detail, is the horse sacrifice, an assertion of sovereignty that blends politics and sacred symbolism into one dramatic act. Yet for all the outward display, the deeper story is that India is becoming more densely connected. Forests are being cut back in places, opening corridors for movement. Rivers are becoming routes of commerce. Town-like settlements begin to appear, not yet the vast cities of later centuries, but places where craft and trade concentrate, where travelers meet, where news spreads. And with all this change comes pressure on the mind as well as the land. A society built around sacrifice and social duty begins to feel the weight of its own complexity. People start to ask quietly at first, then more clearly, what lies beyond the rituals. If the gods are fed through fire, what is the deeper law behind them? If order is maintained through proper action, what is the nature of order itself? You can feel the first stirrings of these questions in the evolving Vedic tradition. The language of the hymns expands. The focus begins to move from outward ritual to inward meaning. Later texts will speak of a reality beneath appearances of a self that is more than the body of a truth that is not captured by wealth or conquest. These ideas will not replace the old world overnight. Instead, they will grow alongside it, like a new branch forming on an ancient tree. Meanwhile, along the edges of the plain, other regions develop their own rhythms. In the northwest, routes remain open to Central Asia through mountain passes, ensuring that India is never entirely enclosed. Along the coasts, small maritime connections continue, even if the great oceanic trade of later eras has not yet fully blossomed. In the Deccan, distinct communities cultivate different crops and build different social patterns, setting the stage for the rich regional diversity that will always be part of India's story. By the end of this long early period, the foundations of the next age are quietly in place. The land is more settled, agriculture is more productive, power is more territorial, competition is sharper. And perhaps most importantly, the world of ideas is beginning to widen, preparing India for an era when towns will grow, merchants will thrive, and new spiritual movements will offer fresh paths through suffering and change. The night deepens over the plain, the fire burns lower. Somewhere, a singer recites an old hymn, and a child listens half asleep, while beyond the village the river continues its steady flow, carrying the future toward unseen cities. Cities, renouncers, and new questions. In the centuries after the hymns were first carried from mouth to memory, the land begins to feel more crowded with possibility. The forests along the Ganges are thinner now, in many places opened by iron and patient labor. Villages sit closer together like beads along a string of water. Paths become roads. River crossings become meeting points. And in the soft hours before sunrise, when the air is still cool, you can imagine the first sounds of a town, waking wooden shutters, lifting clay ovens, warming the low call of a merchant arranging bundles of cloth, the creak of a cart turning toward the marketplace. This is sometimes called India's second urbanization, not because people had forgotten how to build towns, but because a new kind of urban life is emerging, denser, more commercial, more politically organized around larger territorial states. The earlier Indus cities belonged to a different world of bricks and seals. These newer towns and cities grow out of expanding agriculture, rising trade, and the steady consolidation of power in the Ganges plain. By this time, many of the old Janapadas have become larger, stronger realms, known as the Mahajanapadas, great territories. They are not all alike. Some are monarchies ruled by kings who claim noble lineages and enforce their will through officials and soldiers. Others are republic-like confederacies where councils of elites debate and decide, and where power is shared among dominant families. Together, they form a patchwork of competing states, each with its own ambitions, each shaped by the river's roads and fertile land that sustain it. If you travel through this landscape in your mind, you might pass through the kingdom of Kosala or the ancient city of Kashi near the Ganges, where the river bends past ghats and busy banks. You might hear of Avanti in the west, positioned near important trade routes. You might come to the Vaji Confederacy with its assemblies and collective authority. And again you would hear the name of Magadha, a realm in the east that seems to be gathering strength like a storm cloud building at the edge of the horizon. Magadha's rise is not an accident. It sits in a region with rich agricultural land, and it benefits from control of routes along the Ganges. It has access to resources, forests, elephants for warfare and transport, and in some areas iron deposits that support tools and weapons. Its kings begin to fortify settlements and extend control, absorbing rivals and tightening administration. In this age, power increasingly belongs to those who can mobilize surplus grain labor taxes and men. As towns expand, trade grows more visible. Markets become regular institutions rather than occasional gatherings. Goods move not only between neighboring villages, but across long distances, salt from one region, fine textiles from another, metalwork, pottery, beads, and grain. With trade comes a new way of thinking about value. We begin to see the wider use of coinage, small pieces of metal that make exchange easier and more standardized. A coin can pass from hand to hand, linking strangers in a shared system of trust and authority. In the city, life becomes both more connected and more anonymous. A farmer in a village is known by family and lineage. In a town, a person can become a customer, a debtor, a seller, a traveler, roles that shift from day to day. This is not only economic change, it is social change. It alters how people see themselves. And it is in this changing world, this world of growing cities and competitive states, that India's spiritual and philosophical life takes one of its great turns. For centuries, the Vedic tradition had placed ritual at the center, sacrifice performed correctly to maintain cosmic order and secure prosperity. But as society becomes more complex, questions multiply. Some people begin to feel that ritual alone cannot answer the deepest human concerns. What is the self beneath status and duty? Why does suffering persist even when the gods are honored? What lies behind the endless cycle of gain and loss, birth and death? These questions do not come only from scholars in quiet rooms. They rise from the friction of city life, its temptations, its inequalities, its restlessness. They rise from the spectacle of wealth beside poverty, from the fear of illness, from the awareness that every human life, no matter how comfortable, is fragile. In this era, a new kind of seeker becomes prominent, the renouncer, sometimes called a shramana, a person who steps away from household life to pursue liberation through discipline, meditation, and insight. Instead of serving the sacred through sacrifice, the renouncer seeks the sacred through transformation of the mind. Instead of anchoring identity in family property and ritual rank, the renouncer attempts to loosen those bonds. Along forest edges and on the outskirts of towns, you might imagine small communities of such seekers, some living alone, others gathering in groups. They debate, meditate fast, and test ideas, the way a craftsman tests metal, heating it, hammering it, seeing whether it holds. Two of the most influential paths to emerge from this spiritual ferment are Jainism and Buddhism. Both grow in the same broad region of northern India in the same general centuries, and both share certain assumptions common to the age, that life involves suffering or dissatisfaction, that actions have consequences across lifetimes, and that liberation is possible through understanding and disciplined practice. Yet each offers its own distinctive emphasis and tone. Jain tradition centers on the figure of Mahavira, who is remembered as a great teacher and reformer of an older current of ascetic practice. Jainism teaches that living beings are bound by karma not merely as fate, but as a kind of subtle residue created by actions and intentions. To free oneself, one must live with rigorous ethical discipline, above all through nonviolence, ahimsa. This is not simply a rule against harming humans. It extends outward in its fullest expression to animals, insects, and all living things. The world is filled with life, and life is sacred. The Jain path therefore becomes famous for its carefulness, the mindful step, the restraint in speech, the desire to avoid harm, even unintentionally. It is a demanding ideal, but it also creates a powerful moral vision, one that will influence Indian thought deeply, including traditions far beyond Jain communities themselves. Buddhism, meanwhile, is associated with Siddhartha Gautama, who is remembered as the Buddha, the awakened one. The story of his life is told with many layers, but its emotional center is simple and human. A man encounters the realities that cannot be kept outside any palace, aging sickness, death, and the quiet yearning for meaning that arises when pleasure and security prove temporary. He leaves behind privilege and undertakes a long search, trying extreme austerities, then turning away from them when he finds they do not bring clarity. The Buddha's teaching is often described as a middle way, neither indulgence nor self-torment, but a path of insight and practice that aims at freedom from suffering. He speaks of suffering not only as pain, but as the subtle dissatisfaction that clings to desire and fear, to grasping and aversion. He offers a diagnosis and a remedy by understanding how craving and ignorance shape experience a person can loosen the chain that keeps them bound. What made Buddhism especially influential in this urban age was how it organized itself. The Buddha gathered a community, the Sangha, a disciplined group of monks and nuns who lived by rules and traveled to teach. Their lives formed a visible alternative to the household world, a life built on simplicity, ethical conduct, meditation, and learning. In towns and along trade routes, merchants and artisans listened. Some became supporters, offering alms and shelter. Kings and wealthy patrons sometimes offered parks and monasteries. This relationship mattered. It meant that spiritual life was no longer confined to hereditary ritual specialists or to solitary wanderers. It could be supported by ordinary people and woven into the social fabric of cities. Monasteries became places of teaching and debate, and over time, centers of learning that would shape Indian intellectual life for centuries. None of this erased older traditions. Vedic ritual continued, and the developing strands of what we now call Hinduism, devotion, temple, worship, philosophical speculation continued to grow. India's spiritual landscape does not move by replacement. It moves by layering. New paths appear, old paths adapt, and the whole becomes richer, more complex. Politically, the competition among the great states intensifies. Fortified cities rise. Armies become more organized. Diplomacy becomes more intricate. Magadha, in particular, continues to expand. Kings like Bimbisara and Ajatashatru are remembered for strengthening the realm through conquest and strategic alliances, tightening control over river routes and key territories. The stakes are growing larger. Whoever dominates the Ganges plain gains access to wealth, manpower, and legitimacy. In the background, the daily life of millions continues: planting and harvest, weaving and pottery, river travel and temple offerings, household rituals and local festivals. Yet something has undeniably shifted. India is now a land of bigger states and busier towns, of new questions asked aloud of teachers who gather followers not by birthright but by persuasion. The subcontinent is becoming more connected economically, politically, intellectually, and with that connection comes the possibility of empire. As evening falls over a city near the Ganges, lamps begin to glow in doorways. The marketplace quiets, but the mind does not always quiet with it. Somewhere a monk recites a teaching in a steady voice. Somewhere a household offers food into a small flame. Somewhere a traveler listens from the edge of the crowd, feeling that history is moving slowly but irresistibly toward a new kind of power that will try to hold the whole plain in a single grasp. Chandragupta and the making of empire. Before an empire can be proclaimed, there is often a moment when the world feels unsteady, when old powers weaken and the land seems to hold its breath. Picture the northern plain in the late 4th century BCE. The monsoon has passed, leaving fields bright and heavy with grain. Rivers run full and slow, carrying silt that will feed the next season. Along the roads, merchants travel with bundles of cloth and sacks of salt, and behind them come stories of wars in the northwest of foreign soldiers, seen beyond the passes of local kings, bargaining, plotting, and watching one another with careful eyes. In the Punjab, and beyond the memory of Alexander's campaigns, still lingers like a distant thunder. His armies had crossed into the edges of the subcontinent, fought fierce battles, and then tired far from home, pressed by exhaustion and refusal, turned back. He did not stay to rule India, but the disturbance his arrival created mattered. It loosened old arrangements in the northwest and left behind new political fragments, satraps and garrisons, shifting loyalties, and a sense that the world was larger than the horizon of any one kingdom. Farther east, in the rich heartland of the Ganges, plain power was already concentrated. Magadha had been rising for generations, and by this time the Nanda dynasty held sway. The Nandas were remembered as immensely wealthy, their treasury deep, their authority broad, yet they were also remembered in many later traditions as unpopular perhaps for the weight of taxation or the harshness of rule. Whether those portraits are perfectly fair or shaped by later moral storytelling, the underlying truth remains. Magadha was a prize worth fighting for because whoever ruled it could draw on the plain's abundance and the river routes that stitched the region together. It is into this world dense with opportunity and danger that Chandragupta Maurya steps, a figure whose life has reached us through layered traditions. Some accounts picture him as a young man of uncertain origins, ambitious and watchful, noticing the weaknesses of kings and the quiet strength of disciplined organization. Other stories embroider his youth with prophecy and drama. But in the flow of history, what matters most is that Chandragupta became the founder of the first empire to unify much of the Indian subcontinent under a single central authority. At Chandragupta's side, tradition places a brilliant strategist, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, remembered as a teacher and a master of statecraft. Around his name gathers the aura of the Arthashastra, a treatise on governance, economy, diplomacy, and security, practical, unsentimental, and deeply attentive to human motives. Even if the text we have today may have taken shape over time, it preserves a vision of politics as something that must be understood clearly. Without illusions, states rise when they manage resources, loyalty, and information. They fall when they misread the world and neglect the quiet machinery of rule. You can almost sense the two of them, whether as literal partners or as symbols of a broader administrative revolution, standing in the half-light of a hall, speaking softly, so only trusted ears can hear. they are not dreaming of a kingdom in the abstract. They are thinking about roads and grain stores, about officials and spies, about how to turn scattered strength into lasting authority. The overthrow of the Nandas and the rise of the Mauryas is often portrayed as swift and decisive, but such transformations are rarely simple. It would have required alliances, the gathering of soldiers, the neutralizing of rivals, and the careful winning of strategic cities and routes. Power in this era was both physical and psychological. A fortress must be taken, but so must a reputation. A king must command force, but he must also persuade others that resistance is futile, that cooperation brings safety, that his rule is the new shape of the world. When Chandragupta secured Magadha, he inherited not only fertile land and wealth, but also an administrative foundation built by earlier rulers. The Mauryan achievement was to expand and systematize that foundation until it could hold a vast realm. The heart of this new empire beat at Pataliputra, the capital set near the meeting of great rivers. Imagine it at dawn, mist lifting from the water, the outlines of wooden palisades and defensive ditches becoming clearer as the light strengthens. The city is busy even before the sun fully climbs, boats arriving with timber and grain officials moving toward offices, messengers stepping quickly along streets, the smell of cooking fires rising from neighborhoods where artisans and laborers begin their day. Ancient observers described Pataliputra as immense, and even allowing for exaggeration, it was clearly a major center, administrative, military, and economic. To rule from such a city is to rule through systems, written records, appointed governors, tax collection, regulated markets, and the constant movement of information. The empire needed roads not only for armies but for messages, so that orders could travel faster than rebellion. In the Mauryan model, the state did not simply demand loyalty and tribute, it attempted to organize the conditions of prosperity. Agriculture was the base of wealth, so the state's interest reached into irrigation land measurement and the management of forests and mines. Taxes, especially on land, supported the army and bureaucracy, and such taxes could be heavy. But they also created, for the first time on this scale in India, the possibility of sustained imperial projects, fortified cities, protected routes, and a centralized authority that could intervene in distant provinces. The Mauryan army itself became legendary in later memory, a vast force of infantry, cavalry, chariots, and war elephants. In a world where power was often decided by the ability to mobilize quickly and strike hard, elephants were both weapon and symbol, tall, unstoppable, and frightening, the very image of imperial strength moving across the plain. Yet an empire cannot rely on muscle alone. It must see, it must know. Here, the tradition of Mauryan espionage becomes part of the story networks of informants, inspectors, and agents who reported on local officials and potential threats. Whether every detail in later accounts is accurate is less important than the larger point: the Mauryan state treated information as a resource. In a land of many languages, many regions, and many competing loyalties, knowledge was a kind of glue. As Chandragupta expanded westward, the empire's horizon met the wider Hellenistic world that had formed after Alexander's death. In the northwest, the Seleucid ruler, Seleucus I, sought to secure his territories and influence. The encounter between Mauryan India and the successor states of Alexander did not end in endless war. Instead, it moved toward negotiation and settlement. Chandragupta is said to have reached an agreement with Seleucus, exchanging territory and forming ties that included diplomatic contact. Greek ambassadors, most famously Megasthenes, lived at the Mauryan court, and wrote accounts that offered outsiders a glimpse into India's wealth cities and customs. You might imagine a foreign envoy walking through Pataliputra, listening to the unfamiliar music of its languages, watching the river traffic, noticing the variety of clothing and the smell of spices, and realizing that this empire is not a remote edge of the world, but a center in its own right, confident, organized, and vast. Inside the empire, daily life continued with its usual textures. Farmers worked fields that belonged to families and communities, paying their share to the state. Artisans made pottery, textiles, metalwork, and ornaments. Merchants carried goods along roads and waterways, negotiating tolls and regulations. In towns, markets filled with sound, bargaining voices, hoofbeats, clinking metal, the rustle of woven cloth. Religious life remained diverse with Vedic rituals, local cults, and the growing presence of renouncer traditions, including Jainism and Buddhism, moving along the same roads as trade. It is said that later in life, Chandragupta turned toward Jain asceticism, renouncing power and traveling south, leaving behind the heavy world of administration for a quieter search for release. Whether every detail is certain or not, the idea itself feels deeply Indian in its resonance that even an emperor might one day set aside the crown, recognizing that power cannot hold back time. After Chandragupta, the empire passed to his son Bindusara, who maintained and extended Mauryan authority. The machinery of governance kept turning, the provinces watched, taxes were gathered, officials were appointed, and the great state held together. Yet beneath the surface, the future was already forming because within that imperial household, another figure was growing toward his own turning point. His name was Ashoka, and in the quiet corridors of power among the accounts, the courtiers, the rumors, and the steady discipline of rule, you can feel the approach of a reign that will leave a different kind of mark on history, not only conquest and control, but an attempt to reshape empire with the language of conscience. Ashoka's turning of the wheel, night in Pataliputra, can be strangely quiet for a capital that governs so much land. The rivers outside the city walls slide past in the darkness, wide and patient. Lamps burn low in courtyards. Somewhere, a guard's sandals scuff softly on a wooden walkway. Inside the palace complex, the air holds the faint scent of oil and smoke, and behind carved doors, the empire's paperwork sleeps in bundles, accounts of grain lists of villages, reports from distant provinces where the language changes and the hills rise and fall like waves. In this world, a prince grows into the shape of a ruler. Ashoka, grandson of Chandragupta, son of Bindusara, inherits not an uncertain throne, but an established machine of power. The Mauryan Empire is already vast, held together by roads, officials, revenue, and a formidable army. Yet empires are never simply inherited. They must be reasserted through decisions that signal strength, through alliances that must be renewed, through rivals who must be deterred. A new ruler must prove quickly and unmistakably that the center still holds. Tradition remembers Ashoka's early years as energetic, even severe. Whether those portraits are sharpened by later contrast, because his later image becomes so moral and reflective, the reality remains that Ashoka came to power in an imperial world where conquest was normal and where kings were expected to expand and to punish resistance. The ideals of restraint were present in India's spiritual life, but the practice of statecraft still leaned on force. So Ashoka, like so many rulers before him, looked toward the edges of his realm. To the east and south along the Bay of Bengal lay Kalinga, a prosperous region with its own identity, its own coastal trade, and its own proud resistance. Kalinga's position mattered. It was a gateway to maritime routes and an anchor of the eastern seaboard. If the Mauryan Empire wanted to be truly unchallenged, Kalinga could not remain outside its grasp. The war that followed became the most famous conflict of Ashoka's life, not because it was the largest by numbers alone, but because of what it did to the inner story of kingship. In the sources that survive most directly from Ashoka himself, his inscriptions carved into rock faces and pillars, the Kalinga campaign appears as a wound. He speaks not like a triumphant conqueror, but like a man who has seen the cost of power too clearly. He describes the suffering of the conquered death's deportations, grief. The words are not detailed in a gory way, but their weight is unmistakable. It is as if the emperor stands in the open air of the subcontinent and admits in public that conquest leaves a shadow. Imagine him after the campaign riding through land that has been brought under imperial control. The roads are the same kind of roads the Mauryan state knows how to build and patrol, but the faces along them are different now, guarded, tired, uncertain. Fields may be trampled, villages may be missing men, mothers and elders carry their own silent mathematics of loss. Even the air feels changed as if a storm has passed and left the world raw. For many rulers, such a moment would be sealed away, buried beneath ceremonies and proclamations. For Ashoka, it becomes the hinge of a transformation. He turns toward what he calls Dhamma, a word that echoes older ideas of order and right conduct, but which in his usage becomes something like an ethical program for society. It is not in his inscriptions a narrow theology. It is a moral language meant to reach across differences, kindness, restraint, respect for parents and elders, generosity, truthfulness, humane treatment of servants and prisoners, and a reduced appetite for violence, especially violence done for sport or display. This shift does not mean Ashoka dissolves the empire or abandons governance. He remains an emperor, and the Mauryan state remains powerful. But he begins to imagine power as something that can be tempered, guided by responsibility rather than appetite. To make that imagination real, he does something remarkable. For an ancient ruler, he writes it onto the landscape. Across his realm, Ashoka's edicts appear carved on rocks, beside roads inscribed on pillars erected in public places. They are not hidden in palace archives. They stand where travelers might pause, where merchants might read aloud, where local officials cannot pretend ignorance. In these edicts, the emperor speaks in a voice that is at once authoritative and strangely personal, as if he wants the listener to know not only what the law demands, but what his conscience has learned. In some places, he appoints officials known as Dhamma Mahamatas, charged with promoting welfare and ethical conduct, looking after the vulnerable and encouraging harmony among different communities. He speaks of planting trees along roads for shade, digging wells, building rest houses, small acts of public care that taken together make travel safer and life steadier. The empire becomes not only a structure of extraction, but also, at least in ideal, a structure that offers protection and basic support. Ashoka's relationship with Buddhism becomes central to how later generations remember him, and it is true that he becomes one of Buddhism's most powerful patrons. The Buddha's teachings, with their emphasis on compassion and the avoidance of harm, fit naturally with Ashoka's post-Kalinga moral turn. He supports monasteries, encourages the spread of teachings, and in later tradition is linked to councils and missions that carry Buddhism beyond India into Sri Lanka and across routes that lead toward Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Yet it is important to feel the breadth of Ashoka's vision. His inscriptions do not call for a single faith to dominate. They call instead for respect among sects. He acknowledges the variety of religious life in India, Brahmanical traditions, renouncers, local cults, and many paths of practice, and urges tolerance, moderation, and the avoidance of pointless quarrels. In a land already rich with spiritual diversity, Ashoka tries to build unity, not by flattening difference, but by encouraging civility and shared ethical ground. This is one reason his reign matters so deeply in India's long memory. It offers an enduring image, an emperor who tried to bind an empire with words as well as weapons, not merely through fear, but through a public moral identity. Of course, a moral identity does not erase the realities of administration. The Mauryan system still collected taxes. It still relied on officials who could be corrupt, on provinces that could resist, on armies that could be deployed. Ashoka's edicts sometimes sound like responses to practical problems: the need for humane treatment of prisoners, the prevention of unnecessary killing of animals, the encouragement of respectful behavior in a world where power often invites cruelty. The fact that he must urge these virtues suggests that they were not automatic. The empire was still a human institution subject to human habits. And yet, even with those limitations, something has shifted in the historical record. Ashoka's voice survives with unusual clarity. Most ancient empires leave behind monuments that speak of victory. Ashoka leaves behind a record of regret and aspiration. He tries to make conscience part of government, to treat the moral life of the ruler as a public matter. For ordinary people, the empire under Ashoka may have felt both heavy and secure. The roads were safer. Trade moved along predictable routes. Towns benefited from imperial order. Farmers still measured their lives by the monsoon, but the state's presence could be felt in predictable taxation in officials and in the reach of law. The world remained unequal, but it was also in some regions more stable than it might otherwise have been. After Ashoka's long reign, the question becomes the same one that follows every great ruler: can the system hold without him? Moral authority is difficult to inherit. The edicts remain on stone, but stone cannot command loyalty the way a living emperor can. The empire's size, once its greatest strength, becomes a strain. Provinces far from the center require constant attention. Officials must be supervised. Local identities and ambitions do not disappear just because a pillar stands in a marketplace. In the years after Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire begins to loosen. The reasons are debated: economic pressures, administrative overreach, succession struggles, regional assertiveness, but the shape of the story is familiar. An empire that once seemed permanent begins to fragment into smaller powers. Yet the empire does not vanish without leaving gifts behind. It leaves the idea of a subcontinent-wide political imagination that India can at least for a time be held in a single frame. It leaves the memory of roads and administration of public works and imperial law. And above all, it leaves the image of Ashoka, an emperor who turned in the midst of power toward restraint. As the lamps burn low again over Pataliputra, one can almost see the city's future beginning to separate into many futures. Regional courts will rise. New patrons will support new art. Merchants will follow routes that lead beyond the old imperial center. The subcontinent will not become quieter, only more varied. And as Mauryan unity fades, India's story will enter a long, fertile age of regions trade and cultural exchange, where new dynasties will bloom along the borders and the coasts and the world beyond. India will press closer through commerce and migration, bringing fresh influences and fresh tensions like new winds arriving before the next monsoon. After empire regions trade and new patrons. When a great empire loosens, the change is not always loud. There is no single day when the Mauryan world ends and a new one begins. The old roads remain. The pillars stand where they were planted, their inscriptions weathering under sun and rain. In some places, officials continue their routines, collecting revenue, settling disputes, maintaining order as best they can. But slowly, like a river splitting into smaller channels, authority begins to flow in different directions. Pataliputra is still a great city, but its pull is weaker. Provinces look more to their own leaders. Military commanders and regional governors begin to act with greater independence. The vast imperial machine, so effective under Chandragupta and Ashoka, proves difficult to sustain without the same level of central energy and legitimacy. In the centuries that follow, India does not fall into darkness. Instead, it enters a long, complex season of regional kingdoms and expanding connections. Power becomes more local, but the world becomes more open in other ways, especially through trade migration and the movement of ideas. In the north, one of the important successor forces is the Shunga dynasty, which rises in the wake of Mauryan decline. Later traditions often speak of tensions between Shunga rulers and Buddhist institutions, but the reality on the ground was varied. Patronage in India rarely belonged to a single hand. Even as some rulers favored Brahmanical rituals, others continued to support Buddhist monasteries and Jain communities, and ordinary people continued their own worship at local shrines and sacred trees. Religious life, as always, remained layered rather than uniform. Farther south in the Deccan, the Satavahanas begin to emerge as a powerful regional dynasty. Their realm sits across important routes that link the interior to the coasts. Here the land opens into plateau and river valleys, and the political style differs from the heavy centralized bureaucracy of the Mauryas. Kingship is still strong, but it is woven into local networks of clans, towns, and traders. Inscriptions from this era show donors, merchants, guild leaders, even women of means supporting religious monuments, especially Buddhist caves and stupas, leaving their names carved in stone as quiet proof that wealth and faith were now closely intertwined. This is one of the great themes of the post-Mauryan age. Patronage broadens. Under an empire, monumental building often centers on the court. In this more regional commercial era, temples, stupas, and cave monasteries are funded by many hands, kings seeking legitimacy, merchants seeking merit, artisans proud of their craft communities, binding themselves together through shared gifts to the sacred. And alongside this changing pattern of rule, India's long-distance trade begins to shine more brightly in the historical record. The old land routes through the northwest and across the plains remain vital. Caravans carry textiles, spices, gemstones, metalwork, and medicines. But increasingly the sea becomes a highway. Indian merchants learn to trust the monsoon winds which blow seasonally across the Indian Ocean like a promise. Sailors leave western ports as the winds turn favorable, crossing to Arabia and East Africa, returning when the skies shift again. On the eastern coast, routes lead toward Southeast Asia, where Indian goods stories and religious ideas will mingle with local traditions in new and lasting ways. If you stand on the shore of a port city in this era, you can almost hear the language of exchange voices calling across docks, the splash of water against wooden hulls, the creak of rope, the scent of salt and tar. Bales of cloth are loaded. Jars of spices and oils are carried carefully. Beads and gemstones catch the light. Somewhere among the bustle travelers carry something even more valuable than goods information. They bring news of distant lands, of new rulers, of dangers on the road of opportunities in foreign markets. This expanding trade connects India more firmly to the Mediterranean world as well. In the early centuries, BCE and CE Roman demand for luxury goods grows, and Indian products, especially spices, fine textiles, and precious stones, become part of the Roman imagination of wealth. Roman coins have been found in parts of India, quiet evidence of commerce across vast distances. Trade is not only a matter of money, it changes tastes, art styles, and the sense of what is possible. And in the Northwest, India's political landscape becomes even more intertwined with the wider world. After Alexander's retreat, various Indo-Greek kingdoms appear in regions near the Punjab and beyond. These are not simply foreign rulers imposed on a passive land. They are part of a frontier zone where cultures meet and blend. Greek-speaking elites adopt local practices. Local elites engage with Hellenistic forms of art and governance. The result is often a hybrid world coins bearing Greek script on one side and local symbols on the other, rulers who present themselves in multiple cultural languages. Over time, other groups move into this region as well, most notably the Shakas, often called Scythians in older sources, and later the Kushans. These movements are part of larger patterns across Central Asia, where nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples shift in response to pressures and opportunities, moving along routes that have connected Eurasia for millennia. Among these, the Kushan Empire becomes especially significant. Rising in the 1st centuries CE, the Kushans control a realm that spans parts of Central Asia and northern India, sitting astride key trade routes that link China, India, and the Mediterranean. Their rulers are known for patronizing multiple religious traditions. Under Kushan patronage, Buddhism in particular flourishes, and the art of this era becomes one of the most striking developments in Indian cultural history. In regions like Gandhara in the northwest, artists begin to depict the Buddha in human form with greater frequency, using artistic techniques influenced by Hellenistic styles, realistic drapery, naturalistic faces, a sense of three-dimensional presence. This is not merely an artistic shift, it is a devotional one. The image becomes a focus for worship, meditation, and storytelling. The Buddha, once known primarily through symbols, an empty throne, footprints, a wheel, now appears as a compassionate figure with gentle eyes accessible to the human imagination. At the same time, in other parts of India, Buddhist art develops in its own ways, more stylized, more symbolic, deeply rooted in local aesthetics. And alongside Buddhism and Jainism, Brahmanical traditions continue to evolve with new emphasis on devotion to deities like Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess, in forms that will grow increasingly central in the centuries ahead. In this age, India is not one political unit, but it is increasingly one cultural and economic world connected by trade routes, pilgrim paths, and shared ideas. Even as kings fight and borders shift, the movement of merchants and monks creates a kind of underlying continuity. A traveler might move from one realm to another and still find familiar rituals, familiar stories, familiar moral teachings, though spoken in different tongues and shaped by local customs. Daily life, too, carries this sense of layered change. In a town, a guild of potters might sponsor a small shrine. In a village, a harvest festival might blend older local spirits with new devotional songs. In a monastery carved into a hillside, monks might debate philosophy, while donors arrive with food and cloth. On a road, a caravan might pass an imperial ruin from Mauryan days, a reminder that power rises and falls, but the road remains and the journey continues. This is also a time when India's great epics and narrative traditions take on more defined forms even as they draw on older oral layers. Stories of righteous kings and devastating wars of devotion and duty circulate widely. They offer more than entertainment. They provide moral imagination ways for people to think about family loyalty, honor, and the consequences of action. In a world of shifting polities and expanding horizons, such stories help communities hold onto meaning. By the end of this period, the stage is set for another kind of consolidation, not an empire exactly like the Mauryas, but a classical age that will shape the way India is remembered for centuries. In the north, a new dynasty will rise that becomes associated with literature learning and a confident cultural synthesis. The night deepens over the trade roads. A lamp burns in a merchant's house as he counts coins and measures cloth. Far away in a quiet monastery, a monk recites a teaching learned by heart. And beyond them, both the great currents of history begin to gather once more, flowing toward a new dawn of stability and splendor. The Gupta Dawn. There are periods in history when the world feels like a mosaic, many bright pieces each held by its own hand, and then slowly the pieces begin to align into a larger picture. After the Mauryan age, India's political life had been richly varied: regional courts, frontier kingdoms, maritime towns, and trade routes that stitch the subcontinent to the wider world. This variety did not vanish. But in the early centuries of the Common Era, a new kind of northern stability begins to emerge, one that later generations would remember as a classical flowering. The story of the Gupta age does not begin with a sudden conquest announced by trumpets. It begins quietly, like a household lamp being lit before dawn. In the Ganges plain, a family of local rulers gained strength through alliances and careful expansion. Their name, Gupta, will become attached over time to an era of political consolidation and cultural confidence. The earliest Guptas were not the masters of all India. They were one rising power among many. But they occupied a region that mattered: fertile land, important routes, and proximity to older centers of prestige. The ruler most often credited with laying the foundation of Gupta greatness is Chandragupta, who comes to power around the early 4th century CE. His rise is tied not only to military success, but to marriage and alliance with the Lichavis, an influential family or clan whose name carried prestige in the north. This detail matters because it reminds us that kingship is rarely built by force alone. It is built by networks, families, symbols, and the careful weaving together of legitimacy. Chandragupta takes on an imperial title and begins to project authority beyond his immediate homeland. Yet it is his son, Samudragupta, who turns the Gupta realm into a power that later inscriptions describe with a kind of proud poetry. Samudragupta is remembered as a conqueror, a diplomat, and also a patron of culture. In some depictions, he appears not only with weapons, but with a musical instrument suggesting a ruler who embodies both force and refinement. Under Samudragupta, the Guptas expand across much of northern India, and their influence reaches into the Deccan and beyond through campaigns that establish tributary relationships. Not every region is annexed directly. In many cases, local rulers remain in place, acknowledging Gupta supremacy, paying tribute, and receiving recognition. This is a different style of empire than the Mauryan system of tight central bureaucracy. The Guptas rule through a combination of direct control in core areas and flexible arrangements on the periphery. This flexibility is part of what makes Gupta power durable for a time. The empire does not need to administer every village through a single chain of command. It relies on local elites, on alliances, on the willingness of regional rulers to participate in a broader order because it brings them stability and prestige. The capital cities of the Guptas, often associated with places like Pataliputra and later centers, sit in the old heartland of northern power. Imagine a court where the atmosphere is calmer than in an age of constant rivalry. The halls are filled with scholars and poets. Courtiers speak in measured tones. Messengers arrive with tribute fine cloth coins, perhaps rare goods, brought along trade routes that still connect India to distant shores. Because trade remains strong in this period, the Roman world's direct demand for Indian luxuries may fluctuate over time, but Indian merchants continue to move goods across land and sea. Ports on both coasts thrive. Inland towns benefit from river transport and road networks. Coinage circulates and economic life supports urban crafts, long-distance commerce, and the patronage of temples and learning. One of the most important features of Gupta governance is the way land grants become more prominent. Rulers grant land to Brahmins' temples and officials, often with tax privileges. This practice has multiple effects. It helps secure loyalty reward service and supports religious institutions. But it also changes the balance of power in the countryside. Over time, these grants can strengthen local elites and contribute to a more regionalized political structure, one that will matter later when central authority weakens. Still, during the Gupta height, the mood in many parts of northern India is one of relative stability, and stability is fertile ground for culture. This is one reason the Gupta age later becomes associated with classical Indian civilization. Sanskrit, already a language of learned tradition, gains even more prominence as a medium for literature, courtly expression, and intellectual life. Great works of poetry and drama are traditionally linked to this era, including the plays and verses associated with Kalidasa, whose writing evokes seasons' love separation and the beauty of the natural world with a softness that seems perfectly suited to nighttime listening. Whether every text attributed to him belongs precisely to this period is debated, but the broader truth holds: this is an age when refined literature becomes a central marker of elite culture. Alongside literature, religious life continues to evolve. Buddhism and Jainism remain significant, with monasteries and pilgrim sites continuing to attract patronage. But Brahmanical traditions, what we now call forms of Hinduism, gain greater institutional and devotional strength. The worship of Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess becomes increasingly organized around temples and devotional practices. Temple architecture begins to take on more stable forms. Earlier centuries had already seen monumental religious building, but now we see the development of structural stone temples with sanctums that hold images of deities with carved doorways and narratives in relief. These temples are not only places of worship, they are social centers, economic nodes, and symbols of a ruler's legitimacy. To sponsor a temple is to anchor a king's name in the sacred geography of the land. In this era, the idea of the divine becomes more intimate in some traditions. Devotion is not only a matter of grand sacrifice performed by specialists. It becomes increasingly a matter of personal relationship songs, offerings, pilgrimage, and the sense that the sacred can be approached through love and surrender, as well as through ritual correctness. Intellectual life also flourishes. Indian mathematics and astronomy develop in ways that will have lasting influence. The use of a place value system and the conceptual development of zero ideas that will travel and transform global knowledge are associated with the broader Indian scientific tradition that deepens in and around this era. Astronomers observe the movement of planets and stars, building models that blend careful observation with cosmological imagination. To stand under the night sky in Gupta India is to stand under a canopy that scholars are learning to describe with increasing precision, yet also with poetic awe. Meanwhile, art and sculpture reflect both refinement and devotion. Figures of deities are carved with serene expressions and balanced proportions. There is a quiet confidence in these forms, the body, as a vessel of the sacred, the face, calm and inward, the gesture offering blessing. But a classical age is never purely bright. The same structures that produce stability can also deepen hierarchy. Social stratification becomes more elaborated in many regions, and the authority of Brahmanical norms grows stronger in certain texts and practices. Rural life remains demanding. A farmer's prosperity still depends on monsoon and soil and taxes, whether to king, local elite, or temple, still press upon the harvest. Women's lives are shaped by region and class, with some gaining visibility as donors and patrons, while many remain constrained within household expectations. History here is not a golden dream. It is a living world, complex, uneven, and deeply human. At its height, Gupta power reaches a kind of balance strong enough to project authority, flexible enough to accommodate regional elites, prosperous enough to support learning and art. It is not surprising that later generations looking back would see this period as a peak. Yet even as the Guptas flourish, forces beyond the northern frontier are shifting. Central Asia remains a zone of motion where confederations rise and fall and new groups press toward the passes. Trade routes carry not only goods but political pressure, and within the subcontinent the long-term effects of land grants and regional power building continue beneath the surface like roots growing in the dark. So the Gupta Dawn, while bright, carries its own shadow of impermanence. In the evening, a temple lamp glows steadily in a stone sanctum. Outside, the air cools. A poet's words are recited in a courtyard, their sound soft against the night. And beyond the walls of the city, the road runs northward toward the mountains, toward the frontier, where the next great challenge is already gathering its strength, waiting for the moment when the classical bloom begins to tremble. The classical bloom. There is a certain calm that settles over a land when the roads feel safe, when markets open on predictable days, and when scholars can spend long afternoons arguing over ideas that do not need to be proven by the sword. In the Gupta age, much of northern India breathes in that calmer rhythm, never perfectly, never everywhere, but often enough that the memory of it endures. The empire's reach creates corridors of stability. Trade moves with fewer disruptions. Patronage flows steadily from courts and wealthy households into temples, monasteries, and schools of learning. And in that steadier air, art and thought begin to blossom in forms that will shape India's cultural legacy for centuries. Imagine a city along the Ganges in these years. At dawn, the river catches the first light like a sheet of hammered bronze. Boats slide toward the ghats, carrying sacks of grain, bundles of reeds, baskets of fruit. The streets fill gradually, not with frantic noise, but with a practiced bustle. Potters stack their wares. Weavers spread cloth that shimmers faintly in morning sun. Spice sellers open jars and release warm scents into the air. A scribe sits cross-legged, ink dark against palm leaf, his hand steady as he copies a text that has already traveled across generations. It is in such spaces, half practical, half devotional, that the classical mood of the era takes shape. Sanskrit is one of the great vessels of this age. It is not spoken by everyone in daily life. Many languages and dialects flourish across India, but Sanskrit becomes the polished tongue of courtly literature, formal learning, and a certain kind of prestige. To speak it well is to signal training status and belonging to a wider intellectual world. Poetry and drama flourish under this patronage. The works associated with Kalidasa, above all, are remembered for their softness, the way they describe seasons turning lovers, separated by distance clouds, drifting across a landscape like slow-moving messengers. Even when the subject is royal or mythic, the tone can be intimate, attentive to small details, the scent of a flower, the hush before rain, the loneliness that comes when the world grows quiet at night. These literary forms matter historically because they shape how India imagines itself. They create shared references and ideals, what a king should be, what love should feel like, what virtue should sound like when spoken aloud. Stories become bridges between regions, carried by performers, scholars, and travelers. Alongside literature, philosophy, and religious thought continue to deepen. India's older Vedic traditions had already produced the Upanishads with their probing questions about the nature of reality and the self. In the Gupta age, many schools of philosophy refine their arguments and expand their influence, schools that later generations will call by names like Nyaya, logic, Samkhya, analysis of reality into fundamental principles, and Vedanta, interpretations of the Upanishadic vision. These are not merely abstract debates. They shape how people think about duty, liberation, suffering, and the meaning of life. At the same time, devotional traditions become more visible and organized. Worship of Vishnu and Shiva grows stronger in many regions, and the goddess in her many forms, gentle and fierce, protective and overwhelming, takes deeper root. The sacred becomes something that can be approached not only through ritual expertise, but through devotion song and personal offering. Temple building reflects this shift. Earlier ages had seen sacred architecture, but now temples begin to appear with more standardized elements, a sanctum to house an image, a porch for gathering carved doorways that serve as thresholds between ordinary and divine space. Even small temples can feel powerful because they turn stone into narrative. The walls carry reliefs of gods and myths. The entrance becomes a kind of storybook in carved form, inviting the worshiper to step into a world where the divine is close. These temples are not isolated spiritual islands. They sit at the center of community life. Festivals bring crowds. Merchants set up stalls nearby. Artisans find work, carving, painting, and building. Priests organize daily rituals. The temple becomes both sacred center and economic engine, drawing in resources and redistributing them through employment, charity, and celebration. In Buddhist communities, monasteries continue to thrive as well, and they remain important centers of learning. Buddhist philosophy grows increasingly sophisticated, with thinkers exploring the nature of perception, emptiness, and compassion. Jain communities maintain their own rigorous ethical traditions, building institutions that will last for centuries. The subcontinent remains spiritually plural, its landscape dotted with shrines, stupas, temples, sacred groves, and river gates, where countless small offerings are made. If you stand in a Gupta-era town at twilight, you might hear many kinds of devotion at once, a household chanting a temple bell, a wandering monk's recitation, the soft voice of a storyteller, beginning an epic tale to a small crowd. And above these sounds is another kind of quiet achievement, the growth of scientific and mathematical thought. Indian astronomers look at the night sky with careful attention. They track planetary movements, build calendars, and refine methods of calculation. Timekeeping is not merely academic, it is tied to ritual life agriculture and navigation. To predict an eclipse or to calculate an auspicious date is to hold a certain kind of authority, one that blends observation with tradition. Mathematics, in this broader Indian tradition, develops tools that will become globally influential. The place value system allows numbers to be represented and manipulated with new efficiency. The concept of zero, not just as emptiness, but as a number with its own role in calculation, becomes a turning point in human thought. These ideas will travel westward over centuries, transforming science and commerce far beyond India. But here in their homeland, they grow in a world where scholars are supported by patronage and where learning is seen as a form of cultural prestige. Yet the classical bloom is not only a matter of elite courts and scholars. It also rests on the lives of ordinary people whose daily work sustains everything above them. In the countryside, farmers rely on monsoon rains and river irrigation. They plant weed harvest and store grain. They repair field boundaries after floods. They bargain with tax collectors or local agents who represent the king or local landholders. Many live in small villages where community ties are close and where ritual life is woven into the agricultural calendar offerings for rain festivals, after-harvest marriage ceremonies that bind families together. Craftspeople in towns and villages create the material texture of life pottery for storing water iron tools, for farming ornaments, for weddings and festivals, dyed cloth for daily wear and for temple offerings. Guilds, organized groups of artisans and merchants, play important roles in economic life. They can finance buildings, lend money, and support religious institutions. Their existence hints at a society that is increasingly complex with new forms of collective organization beyond clan and kinship. At the same time, the period reflects deepening social stratification. The ideal of a harmonious order, often expressed through the language of duty and social roles, can also become a justification for inequality. Legal and ritual texts in this era sometimes present social hierarchy as divinely grounded. In practice, life is always more complicated than texts suggest, varying by region, occupation, and local custom. Still, the broad trend is that social categories harden in many areas, shaping opportunity and status in lasting ways. Women's roles, too, are complex. In some inscriptions and records, women appear as donors and patrons, supporting temples and monasteries, leaving their names carved into stone as proof of agency and wealth. In literature, women are portrayed in rich emotional tones: lovers, queens, mothers, sages. Yet these portrayals often sit beside social expectations that constrain women's independence. The lived reality varied widely by class and region, but the pressure of patriarchal norms grows stronger in many elite frameworks. So when we speak of the classical bloom, we should picture it with both light and shadow, refined art and deep learning, but also social rigidity, prosperity and trade, but also the vulnerability of farmers to drought and tax, devotional warmth, but also the political need to use religion as legitimacy. And politics, even in stable periods, never truly sleeps. Gupta rulers after Samudragupta, especially Chandragupta II, often remembered as Vikramaditya, preside over a strong empire with flourishing court culture. Yet the empire's borders remain contested. Rival powers exist in the west and the Deccan. Frontier zones remain active. Central Asia continues to shift, and groups beyond the northwestern passes watch for weakness. In a world connected by trade routes, political pressure can arrive, like wind felt, first at the edges, then moving inward. By the late Gupta period, those pressures begin to intensify. New waves of invaders, often grouped under the name Hunas in Indian sources, push into northern India. Their arrival is part of larger Central Asian movements. They do not come as a single clean event, but as repeated incursions and settlements that strain Gupta resources and stability. The empire responds sometimes successfully, but the cost is real. Wars drain treasuries. Local elites become more independent. The land grant system, which once helped secure loyalty, also strengthens regional powers that can later stand on their own. Slowly, the coherent classical world begins to fragment. Still, even as political unity trembles, cultural life remains strong. Temples continue to be built, texts continue to be copied, stories continue to be told. And this is one of India's deepest historical patterns. Political structures rise and fall, but cultural traditions often persist and adapt, carried by communities rather than dependent on a single throne. As the night sky stretches over the plain, an astronomer marks the position of a bright planet. A temple priest lights the evening lamp. A storyteller recites an epic passage to listeners who sit in the dust leaning into the sound. And far to the northwest, beyond the familiar roads, riders move in the darkness carrying the tremor of change toward a world that has grown used to calm. Fractured crowns and southern horizons. When the center loosens, the edges do not simply fall away. Often they grow vivid. After the height of the Guptas, northern India begins to fragment into a landscape of regional powers. The great imperial frame that once gave the plains a shared political rhythm becomes thinner. Courtly life continues, temples still glow with evening lamps, and merchants still travel the roads, but authority is more divided. Many rulers rise, each holding a smaller piece of the old world, each seeking legitimacy through lineage, conquest, and patronage. In the north, the pressure from the Huna Central Asian groups, whose incursions strain Gupta resources, contributes to this unraveling. These conflicts disrupt trade and drain treasuries. Even where rulers defend their territories successfully, the effort weakens the fabric of central control. Local elites, already strengthened by land grants and regional responsibilities, become more independent. Provinces begin to behave like kingdoms. The result is not one uniform collapse, but a patchwork of crowned centers. Cities and forts stand as islands of power. River valleys and fertile tracts become contested prizes. Alliances shift like weather. A ruler's influence may be strong in one generation and vanish in the next, leaving behind only inscriptions on stone and the ruins of walls. Yet in this same period, roughly the early medieval centuries, India's story begins to shine more strongly in the south. The subcontinent's southern regions had always been dynamic with their own languages, cultures, and political traditions. But now, as the northern plain becomes more divided, the Deccan, and the far south, produce powerful, distinctive kingdoms whose achievements will shape India's religious and artistic life for centuries. To understand this shift, it helps to feel the geography again. The Deccan Plateau is not like the Ganges Plain. It is higher, often drier, with rocky outcrops and river valleys that cut their own pathways. Its agriculture relies on different patterns of rainfall and irrigation. Its routes connect inland towns to coastal ports, and its politics often revolve around control of passes, fortresses, and fertile pockets of land. One of the great early medieval dynasties of the Deccan is the Chalukyas. Centered at Badami in the 6th century, and later connected to other branches, the Chalukyas become known for their military strength and their patronage of art and architecture. They stand at a crossroads between north and south, absorbing influences and shaping them into new forms. Not far away, the Pallavas rise along the southeastern coast with their capital at Kanchipuram. The Pallava realm flourishes as a center of learning and temple building. Kanchipuram becomes famous not only as a political hub, but as a sacred city filled with shrines and scholars. From this region come some of the earliest large-scale experiments in stone temple architecture in the south, structures that feel both solid and alive, their carved surfaces crowded with deities, dancers, and mythic scenes. If you walk through the Pallava temple complex at Mahabalipuram, you can imagine the sound of waves nearby and the steady tapping of chisels. Stone becomes a kind of language here. Reliefs depict gods and epic narratives with dramatic movement. Temples are carved not only for worship, but for the proclamation of royal legitimacy. A king builds in stone to show that his rule is anchored in the sacred. And along with temples comes a devotional shift that will become one of the deepest currents in Indian history, the rise and spread of bhakti devotional worship expressed through intense personal love for the divine. Bhakti is not entirely new. Devotional impulses had long existed. But in these centuries, bhakti becomes more visible, more vocal, and more deeply woven into public religious life. Saints and poets often remembered as the Nayanars devoted to Shiva and the Alvars devoted to Vishnu compose songs in Tamil that speak not in the distant tone of formal ritual, but with intimacy and longing. Their verses describe the divine as near, as beloved, as something you can cry out to in the night. This devotional poetry does not stay in quiet corners. It moves through towns and villages carried by singers and pilgrims, reshaping the emotional landscape of worship. This matters historically because it shifts the balance of religious authority. Brahmin priests remain important, temples remain central, and ritual continues, but bhakti offers another doorway, a path open to many kinds of people, emphasizing heartfelt devotion and ethical life. It also helps knit together regions through shared pilgrimage networks as devotees travel from shrine to shrine, mapping the land through sacred song. In the north, while Sanskrit remains influential, regional languages and literatures also grow stronger. In the south, Tamil stands as one of the world's great classical languages, with ancient poetic traditions that now mingle with new devotional forms. Over time, other regional languages will also flourish, each shaping local identity and cultural life. Politically, the early medieval period is marked by rivalry among these regional powers. In the Deccan dynasties like the Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, and others compete for territory and prestige. Their conflicts are often focused on strategic regions, river valleys, fertile plains, and trade routes, rather than on the dream of universal empire. Warfare exists, but it is interwoven with diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the constant need to cultivate legitimacy through patronage of temple scholars and the arts. One of the great gifts of this era is architectural experimentation. In many regions you see the building of temples not only as places of worship, but as centers of social life, administrative activity, and economic exchange. A temple is a storehouse of wealth, a keeper of land, grants a hub for artisans, and a stage for festivals that bring entire communities together. In the Deccan, the rock-cut caves of Ajanta and Ellora, though spanning multiple centuries, capture this spirit of layered religious life. Buddhist monasteries and Hindu and Jain temples exist side by side in carved stone, reflecting a world where multiple traditions can flourish in proximity. The paintings of Ajanta, with their quiet faces and rich colors, preserve a sense of devotional and courtly life that still feels close, like watching lamplight flicker across ancient walls. Trade continues to bind India to the ocean world. Southern ports send textile spices and other goods outward. Merchant communities become powerful patrons of temples and monasteries. Cultural influences move in both directions as Indian religious ideas and artistic motifs travel toward Southeast Asia, while new goods and new connections flow back. In this era, India's political story becomes less about a single throne and more about a shifting constellation of courts. But culturally, the subcontinent is becoming even more richly interconnected. Pilgrims move along new sacred routes. Merchants connect coasts and interiors. Poets sing in languages that carry the divine into everyday speech. Temples rise like mountains of stone, anchoring memory into landscape. And yet, even as the South blossoms, the North is not still. New forms of power are emerging there as well, often centered around fortified towns and warrior elites, in a world where control of land and tribute becomes increasingly contested. The seeds of later medieval polities are being planted, along with new encounters that will bring Islam more fully into the subcontinent's political and cultural life. For now, as the sun sets over the southern hills, temple bells ring in the cooling air. Oil lamps illuminate carved stone faces. A singer's voice carries a devotional hymn across a courtyard, and listeners feel perhaps that the divine is not far away, not beyond the sky, but near enough to be addressed in the language of the heart. And as that voice fades into the night, the next chapter begins to gather the rise of great southern empires that will not only command land, but command the sea. The Chola Sea-Roads. In the far south of India, there are mornings when the air feels washed clean, when the sky is pale and wide, and palm fronds barely move in the gentlest wind. In villages along the Kaveri River, you can hear water before you see it flowing through channels that have been tended for generations. The river is not only a ribbon of silver, it is an engine of life, feeding rice fields that stretch out like green mirrors and carrying boats that move slowly between market towns. It is in this fertile river-fed world that the Chola Empire rises to its greatest height. The Cholas were not newcomers. Their name appears in ancient Tamil traditions and early references, suggesting a long memory of rule in the southern peninsula. But the Cholas of the medieval era, especially from the 9th century onward, build something larger and more enduring than earlier regional kingship. They create a state that is grounded in agrarian wealth, strengthened by disciplined administration, and extended by a bold maritime reach. To understand how this happens, it helps to begin not with battles, but with irrigation. In the Kaveri Delta, water management is power. Channels must be dug and repaired. Tanks and reservoirs must be maintained. Floods must be controlled. In years of good rain, surplus grain can be stored and traded. In years of weak monsoon, careful distribution can mean survival. Over time, the Chola state becomes deeply involved in this landscape of water and labor, organizing the conditions that allow rice cultivation to flourish. When agrarian surplus grows, it supports more than full granaries. It supports artisans, soldiers, administrators, and temple institutions. It supports cities with markets and workshops. It supports the building of monuments in stone that can outlast any king's lifetime. The Chola rulers, especially figures like Rajaraja I and his son Rajendra. I harness this base with a confidence that feels almost like the turning of a great wheel. They expand territory across southern India, securing key regions and rival centers. They move against competing dynasties, including the Pandyas and others, and establish Chola authority over wide stretches of the peninsula. But the most distinctive feature of Chola power is that it does not stop at the shoreline. India's ocean had long been a highway known to merchants and sailors who trusted the monsoon winds. The Cholas take this older maritime knowledge and apply it to imperial ambition. They develop naval capabilities that allow them to project force and influence across the Bay of Bengal. Their campaigns reach into Sri Lanka and toward Southeast Asia, touching realms connected to the trading networks of the time. This does not mean the Cholas conquered all of Southeast Asia in the way modern empires colonize. The ocean world is more complex than that. What Chola expeditions demonstrate is the ability to intervene, to strike at key ports, to secure trade routes, to signal dominance, and to insert Chola power into the political calculus of distant kingdoms. It is a maritime assertion of presence built on the recognition that controlling sea lanes can be as important as controlling land. Imagine a fleet leaving a southern port. The air is thick with salt and warm wind. Sailcloth snaps softly. Wooden hulls rock against one another. Men load provisions, rice, dried fish, water jars, and the smell of tar and rope fills the dawn. As the ships move out, the coastline recedes and the sea becomes a wide plain of motion, carrying them toward foreign harbors where different languages are spoken and different gods are honored, yet where the hunger for trade and power feels familiar. Back on land, Chola governance is marked by a remarkable intertwining of local institutions and royal authority. In many areas, village assemblies and local bodies play important roles in managing land irrigation and community affairs. These institutions are not democracy. In a modern sense, participation can be restricted by status and property. But they do show that the Chola state is not simply a top-down machine. It relies on local organization, drawing strength from a social structure that can mobilize labor and resources efficiently. At the heart of this system stands the temple. Chola temples are not merely places of prayer. They are administrative centers, landlords, banks, employers, and cultural stages. They receive land grants, collect revenue, and redistribute wealth through salaries, charity, and festival spending. They commission sculpture, bronzes, painting, and music. They keep records. They employ dancers, musicians, priests, cooks, guards, and scribes. The great temple of Brihadisvara at Tanjavur, associated with Rajaraja I, stands as one of the most powerful expressions of this world. Picture its towering form rising above the town, its stone mass catching sunlight, its shadow cooling the ground below. Inside, the sacred space feels both grand and intimate. The scent of incense, the murmur of prayers, the sound of feet on stone. The temple's walls are carved with images that tell stories of gods and kings, devotion and power braided together. And then there are the Chola bronzes, perhaps the most famous artistic legacy of the dynasty. These are not cold, stiff statues. They feel alive. Shiva as Nataraja, lord of the cosmic dance, 1 foot, lifted hair flow in flames encircling him like a ring of time itself. In these bronzes, movement becomes sacred. The divine is not distant and unmoving. The divine dances. The importance of this art is not only aesthetic. It reflects a devotional culture where the deity is not only housed in a sanctum, but carried out into the world during festivals. Bronze images can be paraded through streets accompanied by music and chanting, allowing entire communities to experience the sacred as presence in motion. Devotion becomes public and communal, woven into the social calendar like monsoon and harvest. In these same centuries, Tamil devotional literature continues to flourish, deepening the emotional language of bhakti. Saints' songs are sung in temples and homes, shaping how people imagine their relationship to Vishnu Shiva and the goddess. The gods are praised as protectors, beloveds, and sometimes as overwhelming forces that both terrify and comfort. Economically, the Chola age benefits from active trade. The Indian Ocean world is at a high point of commercial connectivity. Merchants organize into powerful guilds, sometimes operating across regions and even overseas. South India exports textiles, spices, and other goods. Ports on both coasts see foreign ships. In return come luxury items, horses, metals, and ideas. The sea again is not a boundary, it is a bridge. This global connection shapes the Chola political imagination. A ruler who can influence the sea lanes can influence wealth. Wealth supports temples, armies, and the spectacle of kingship. And the spectacle, in turn, reinforces legitimacy, persuading subjects and rivals that the Chola order is stable and favored by the divine. Yet, even at the height of Chola power, the familiar truth remains: stability is never permanent. The resources required to maintain an empire are immense. Wars strain treasuries. Rivals wait for moments of weakness. Regional identities persist beneath imperial banners. Over time, the Cholas faced challenges from competing dynasties, shifting alliances, and the gradual rise of new powers. Still, their legacy endures in stone and bronze, in temple records and devotional songs, in the memory of an age when southern India looked outward over the ocean with confidence, and when kings built not only forts and armies, but sacred mountains of architecture that still stand in quiet awe. As evening falls over Tanjavur, the great temple's silhouette darkens against a fading sky. Lamps are lit along corridors. A bronze image glints softly in firelight. Outside in the town, merchants close their stalls, and families return home, their lives touched by the rhythms of empire, even when they do not speak of it. And in the wider subcontinent, another shift is beginning. New courts rising in the north, new forms of warfare and fort culture, and new religious currents arriving more fully through trade and migration. India's story is moving into a period of fresh encounters where the old patterns of kingship will meet new ones, and the land will learn once again to adapt. New courts, new armies, new faiths. There is a particular feeling that comes when an old order begins to thin, not quite a collapse, not quite a peace, but a restless in-between. Forts grow more important, roads feel less certain. Kings watch their borders with sharper eyes, And in marketplaces amid the usual business of grain and cloth, you begin to hear new languages spoken by travelers who have come from farther away than before. By the time the great southern dynasties like the Cholas have stamped their presence on temple walls and sea routes, the wider subcontinent is already shifting into a new medieval rhythm. In many regions, power concentrates in fortified centers, hilltop strongholds, walled towns, and riverbank citadels. Control of land remains the foundation of wealth, but the ways of holding land and defending it are changing. And new religious currents long present through trade and small communities begin to become more politically visible. In northern and western India, a broad cluster of warrior elites rises and becomes increasingly prominent in later memory under the name Rajput. The word itself is complex, more an evolving social and political identity than a single ethnic group, but the historical pattern is clear. Regional lineages build power through military service, strategic marriage alliances, and control of fortresses and surrounding countryside. Imagine a fort at dawn in Rajasthan or the hill regions, stone walls still cool from the night banners hanging slack before the wind picks up. Below the landscape is harshly beautiful scrubland, rocky ridges, distant fields clinging to water sources. In such environments, the ability to defend a stronghold can mean survival. Politics becomes intimate, and local loyalty to a clan leader, negotiation among neighboring rulers, quick raids and counter-raids, and the careful management of honor and reputation. Yet even in these fortress worlds, life is not only war. Courts develop their own culture, bards recite genealogies and heroic tales, artisans craft weapons with delicate inlay, temples and shrines receive patronage, merchants move through gates under the watch of guards. In many places, the rhythm of agrarian life continues beneath the shadow of fort walls, plowing and sowing, harvesting and storing, always mindful of rain and tax and the possibility of disruption. In the Deccan, too, power remains competitive. Dynasties like the Chalukyas and later the Rashtrakutas, and then others rise and fall through warfare and patronage. Each court wants to be seen as legitimate, and legitimacy in India is often expressed through sacred architecture support for learned traditions and association with divine favor. Temples continue to multiply, and regional styles become more distinct. The curves, carvings, and tower forms of one area differ from another, as if the land itself is speaking through stone. All of this is happening in a wider world that is becoming even more tightly connected. Across the Indian Ocean, Islamic societies are flourishing in West Asia and beyond. Merchants sail from Arabia and the Persian Gulf to India's western ports. Some settle. They marry locally formed communities, build mosques, and create networks that link coastal India to a broader commercial world. These coastal connections are among the earliest sustained presences of Islam in India, quiet, practical, and rooted in trade. If you stand in a western port town, perhaps along the Konkan coast or in Gujarat, you might hear the call of seabirds and the clatter of loading docks, and among the voices bargaining over goods, you might catch Arabic or Persian mingling with local tongues. Here Islam arrives not primarily as conquest, but as contact merchants and sailors carrying not only goods but faith law and new forms of cultural expression. Over time, Sufi mystics, Islamic spiritual teachers, also travel through South Asia. Their approach often emphasizes devotion, love of God, and ethical transformation. Sufi lodges and shrines become places where people gather for teaching and remembrance, sometimes attracting followers across social boundaries. These early spiritual networks will become increasingly important in the centuries to come, shaping the emotional and devotional landscape of the region. And then there are the land routes of the Northwest, the old corridors through mountains and passes that have always linked India to Central Asia. Through these routes come not only traders, but armies. The political world beyond the passes has shifted many times since the Kushans, and now new powers, Turkic and Afghan groups among them, are rising in Central and West Asia. They bring new military technologies and organizational patterns, including highly mobile cavalry forces trained with composite bows and systems of governance shaped by Islamic legal and administrative traditions. In this era, the boundary between inside and outside India is never fixed. The Northwest has always been a meeting zone. But now the scale and intensity of political contact increases, and it begins to reshape the politics of the North in a more direct way. The first major moment of this shift is often associated with Mahmud of Ghazni in the early 11th century. His raids into northern India, aimed at wealth, prestige, and political influence, do not immediately create a lasting Indian empire under his rule, but they do signal a new pattern of military pressure from the Northwest. Temples and cities become targets not only for territorial control, but for resources that can finance wider ambitions elsewhere. Local rulers, already divided, find themselves facing a new kind of threat. Yet it is important to hold the tone gently here. These events are often remembered in sharp emotional ways, but history is rarely a simple story of one side versus another. The subcontinent's political fragmentation makes it vulnerable, and the wider Eurasian world is changing with new empires rising and seeking wealth and legitimacy. The result is conflict, yes, but also inevitably new forms of synthesis and adaptation. As we move through the 12th century, the pressure becomes more sustained. Figures like Muhammad of Ghor and his generals push deeper, not merely raiding, but establishing the foundations of rule in northern India. Battles at key points, especially in the northwestern approaches, and the plains begin to determine who will control major cities and revenue-rich regions. And when that control becomes durable, a new political structure begins to form the Delhi Sultanate. But before we reach Delhi's great gates, it helps to understand what is changing in the fabric of governance and military life. In many Indian regions, warfare had long relied on a mix of infantry, cavalry, and elephants, with fortresses anchoring territory. Now highly mobile cavalry becomes even more central in the north, enabling rapid campaigns and flexible tactics. Alongside military shifts come new administrative patterns, land revenue systems, organized differently courts that use Persian as a language of elite culture and record, and the arrival of new artistic and architectural forms. At the same time, Indian society does not simply absorb these changes passively. Local elites negotiate, resist, ally, and adapt. Some warrior groups enter the service of new rulers. Some regions remain outside direct control. Religious life remains diverse, and the arrival of Islam adds another deep layer, rather than replacing what came before. You can feel this layering in the very texture of towns. A market might have Hindu merchants, Jain bankers, and Muslim traders, each living under different customs, yet sharing the same streets and economic rhythms. A fort might have older shrines within its walls and new administrative offices nearby. A Sufi gathering might occur not far from a temple festival, both using music and devotion to reach toward the sacred. This is also a period when vernacular cultures deepen. Regional languages become more prominent in literature and devotional song. Bhakti movements continue to grow, emphasizing personal devotion and ethical life, sometimes speaking in ways that challenge rigid social hierarchies. These devotional currents will eventually intersect, sometimes surprisingly, with Sufi traditions, both valuing inner experience over mere outward form. Therefore, the flow of time ahead is a shift of shifting balance, old dynasties still powerful in many regions, especially in the south, new fortress cultures in the north and west, expanding trade networks, and new religious presences becoming more visible. India is not moving toward a single destiny. It is moving into a more complex, more layered, medieval world. As night falls over a fortified town, the gates close, torches flicker along the walls. Inside, families settle into courtyards, while beyond the walls, the road continues into darkness toward Delhi, toward new courts, toward a political transformation that will gather northern India into a different kind of empire. Sultanates of the North Delhi and the world beyond Delhi at dusk has a particular kind of glow. Dust hangs in the air after a day of movement, carts, rolling feet, passing animals, led through narrow lanes. The sky softens into amber and gray, and along the edges of the city, the first lamps begin to appear like scattered stars. Beyond the walls, the plain stretches outward in quiet darkness, but within the gates there is life gathered. Close merchants closing stalls, guards changing shifts, water carriers calling softly as they move through the streets. In the centuries after the first durable conquests from the northwest, northern India enters a new political frame. It is not the first time the subcontinent has been connected to wider Eurasian currents, but now the connection becomes institutional, woven into the structures of rule. This is the age of the Delhi Sultanate. The Sultanate does not arrive as a single smooth event. It forms through campaigns, negotiations, and the steady building of authority in the Gangetic heartland. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the foundations are laid under leaders who begin as generals and governors for wider powers in Central Asia. Over time, Delhi becomes the center of an independent ruling system that will last in changing dynasties for centuries. The early rulers, often associated with the Mamluk or slave dynasty, come from a world where military service and political rise are closely linked. Many had been trained as elite soldiers, shaped by a culture of cavalry warfare and disciplined organization. But to rule India is not only to win battles. It is to govern an immense and varied society, one of deep agrarian wealth, countless local identities, and older traditions of authority rooted in temple networks, landholding elites, and regional courts. So the Sultanate becomes, in part, an experiment in adaptation. At its core is the extraction and management of revenue. Northern India's plains are extraordinarily productive, and control of land revenue is the foundation of state power. The Sultanate develops administrative systems to assess, collect, and redistribute this wealth, supporting armies, maintaining forts, paying officials, and financing the court. In this process, new elite cultures become prominent. Persian emerges as a major language of administration and high culture in many Sultanate courts. Alongside it come new literary traditions, chronicles, poetry, and ethical writings, shaped by the broader Islamic world, but responsive to Indian realities. Delhi becomes not only a political center, but a cultural one, attracting scholars, poets, and artisans from across regions. Yet it is important to feel that the Sultanate does not rule a uniform land. Its authority is uneven, contested, and often dependent on local cooperation. The Sultanate's reach expands and contracts depending on the energy of a ruler, the strength of governors, and the constant pressure of rebellion and regional ambition. In many areas, the Sultanate establishes control through a network of governors and military commanders who hold territories in exchange for service and loyalty. These arrangements can be effective, but they can also be unstable. A governor far from Delhi might grow powerful, begin to act independently, or even declare a separate kingdom. This pattern center and periphery in tension will repeat again and again. Still, during strong reigns, the Sultanate extends its influence widely. One of the most striking rulers in early Sultanate history is Alauddin Khalji, who rules in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. He is remembered for ambitious campaigns, strong centralization, and intense economic control. His era is often associated with efforts to strengthen the state's ability to extract revenue and support military expansion. Markets in Delhi are said to have been regulated closely, prices controlled to support the army and prevent profiteering. Whether every detail in later accounts is perfectly accurate or shaped by dramatic storytelling, the core historical theme is clear: the Sultanate is a state deeply concerned with resources and order in a competitive political world. Alauddin's reign is also shaped by the looming shadow of the Mongols. Across Eurasia, the Mongol expansions have transformed the world-toppling empires and redrawing political maps. Northern India is not conquered by the Mongols in the way parts of Central Asia and Persia are, but the threat is very real. Repeated Mongol raids press on the Sultanate's frontiers, forcing rulers to invest in defense and military readiness. In a sense, Delhi's rulers are governing not only India, but an exposed edge of a world in motion. This larger Eurasian context matters. It helps explain why the Sultanate is so militarized, why rulers are anxious about loyalty, why fortifications and cavalry remain central. India is part of a connected medieval world where empires rise and fall with astonishing speed and where survival requires constant vigilance. Yet alongside warfare and administration, life continues in the cities with its own rich texture. Delhi grows as a metropolis of craftsmen and traders. Its neighborhoods hold different communities, soldiers and administrators, merchants and artisans, scholars and religious figures. Mosques rise not only as places of prayer, but as social institutions. New architectural forms appear: arches and domes, intricate stonework calligraphy carved into walls. Older Indian building traditions do not disappear. Instead, they mingle and adapt, shaping what will become distinct Indo-Islamic styles. The city's spiritual life is layered as well. Sufi orders become increasingly important in the religious and social landscape. Sufi saints and teachers attract followers who seek guidance, blessing, and ethical counsel. Their shrines become places of pilgrimage where people gather for prayer, music, and remembrance. In these spaces, distinctions of status can soften, at least for a while, as devotion creates its own community. This does not mean the Sultanate is a realm of effortless harmony. Conflicts exist: political, social, and at times religious. Temples may be targeted in certain campaigns, some conversions occur, and legal distinctions shape the lives of different communities. But it is also true that collaboration and coexistence are constant features of daily life. Many Hindu elites and administrators serve within Sultanate structures. Economic life depends on cooperation. Local rulers negotiate terms of submission and autonomy. Cultural exchange is not an occasional accident. It is woven into the fabric of governance and urban life. In the countryside, farmers continue to plant and harvest, but the demands of the state can feel heavier or differently organized than before. Revenue assessments may change. Local intermediaries gain importance. In some regions, the pressure of taxation and conflict can lead to migration or hardship. In others, relative stability allows agrarian expansion and market growth. The experience of the Sultanate is not uniform across India, and that unevenness will shape regional trajectories for centuries. As time passes, the Sultanate itself shifts through dynasties. The Tughlaqs, for instance, take power in the 14th century and preside over ambitious projects and dramatic challenges. Muhammad bin Tughlaq is remembered for bold experiments, some visionary, some disastrous, showing how fragile even strong states can be when policy outruns practical capacity. His successor, Firuz Shah Tughlaq, is remembered for public works, canals, and urban projects, suggesting a turn toward consolidation and welfare measures even amid political strain. Then, in 1398, a catastrophe strikes that reveals the Sultanate's vulnerability, the invasion of Timur, who sacks Delhi and leaves devastation in his wake. The event does not erase the Sultanate instantly, but it shatters its authority and accelerates fragmentation. Regional kingdoms and sultanates grow stronger. Bengal, Gujarat, Malwa. The Deccan, each developing its own court culture and political agenda. And yet, even as Delhi's dominance weakens, something important has happened. Northern India has been drawn into a new political cultural world where Persianate court culture, Islamic legal traditions, and Indian social realities interact continuously. New languages and styles emerge from this interaction. Over time, forms of Hindavi, eventually developing into Urdu and modern Hindi registers, take shape in everyday speech and poetry, carrying vocabulary and imagery from multiple sources. Music, cuisine, dress, and architecture reflect the blending of worlds. So the Sultanate era is not only a story of conquest and rule, it is also a story of cultural formation of India, becoming in new ways a meeting ground of traditions. As the 15th century approaches, Delhi's central grip is weaker. Regional powers hold their own courts. The Deccan sees the rise of the Bahmani Sultanate and later successor, states each fostering their own art and architecture. In the north, new forces begin to gather, including the growing strength of Mughal-descended Central Asian lineages that look toward India's wealth and strategic position. In the evening, Delhi's streets quiet again. The call to prayer drifts into the cooling air. Somewhere not far away, a temple bell answers with a different tone. In a courtyard, a poet recites a verse that mixes languages with ease. And beyond the city, the roads lead outward into a subcontinent of many courts, each waiting perhaps unknowingly for the next great imperial attempt to gather India into a single frame once more. The Mughal moment, gardens of power. There are empires that feel like fortresses, hard defensive, built to withstand siege. And there are empires that try to feel like gardens, ordered, watered, carefully designed, inviting you to believe that power can be graceful. The Mughal Empire at its height tries to be both. To enter the Mughal story, imagine a morning in North India when the heat has not yet fully risen. The air is cool enough to breathe deeply. In the distance, a city's domes and minarets catch the first light. In a garden enclosure, water runs through narrow channels, dividing paths into measured squares. Birds call softly from trees brought from far places. The scent of blossoms mixes with damp earth. In such a space, the Mughal idea of rule becomes visible, kingship as order, abundance, and beauty power, made to look inevitable and serene. The Mughal dynasty begins with a crossing. In 1526, Babur descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan. A Central Asian ruler with a poet's eye defeats Ibrahim Lodi at the First Battle of Panipat and establishes Mughal presence in northern India. Babur's arrival is not simply a foreign invasion. It is part of a long history of movement through the Northwest Passes. Yet it marks a new chapter because Babur brings with him a specific kind of military advantage: mobile cavalry, effective use of field tactics, and, crucially, a growing reliance on gunpowder weapons and artillery that begin to reshape warfare on the plains. Babur, however, does not live long enough to fully build an imperial structure. His son Humayun struggles, losing control for a time to the Afghan ruler Sher Shah Suri, who briefly establishes his own powerful regime. This interlude is historically important. Sher Shah's administration, road building, and revenue reforms leave lasting marks, showing again that India's political evolution often proceeds through overlap and inheritance. One ruler's system becomes another ruler's foundation. When Humayun returns and when his son Akbar comes to the throne, the Mughal story truly deepens. Akbar's reign is one of the great turning points in Indian history. He inherits a fragile empire and turns it into a formidable, expansive state, one that holds much of the subcontinent under a unified imperial frame, while also developing a distinctive political philosophy for governing diversity. If you picture Akbar, do not imagine only a conqueror on horseback. Imagine also a ruler listening. In the halls of Fatehpur Sikri, his planned capital with its courtyard's red sandstone walls and carved columns, you can imagine debates unfolding late into the evening. Scholars and theologians, poets and courtiers, speak of the nature of truth, of ethics, of the divine. Akbar is remembered for inviting people of different faiths and schools, Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Christians, and others, into dialogue. The details of these exchanges are often layered with later interpretations, but the underlying theme is real. Akbar sought a basis for unity that did not depend solely on religious uniformity. Politically, this is practical. The Mughal Empire rules a land where most subjects are not Muslim, where regional elites, especially Rajput lineages, hold significant power and legitimacy. Akbar's genius is to weave many of these elites into the imperial fabric through alliance rather than constant suppression. Marriage ties honors and service in the Mughal military administrative system bring powerful families into partnership with the throne. This does not erase tensions, but it creates a durable structure in which diverse groups have a stake. At the heart of Mughal governance is a sophisticated system of revenue collection and military service, often associated with the Mansabdari system, ranks assigned to nobles, tied to obligations to supply troops and serve the emperor. In practice, it is a way of organizing loyalty and distributing power, ensuring that elites depend on imperial favor while also giving them roles in governance. Alongside this is a detailed land revenue system refined under Akbar and his ministers that assesses agricultural production and channels wealth to the state. The Mughal Empire's strength rests, as so often in India, on the countryside. Fields, villages, irrigation systems, and the lives of peasants and landlords form the base of imperial wealth. The Mughal state, like others before it, depends on extracting surplus, but it also depends on maintaining stability so that surplus continues to exist. too much disruption, and the tax base collapses. So Mughal rulers cultivate order not only through force, but through administrative routine. In the cities, Mughal rule produces a magnificent court culture. Persian remains a major language of administration and elite literature, and Mughal patronage supports painting, architecture, music, and scholarship. Mughal miniature paintings capture court life with astonishing detail: the folds of fabric, the posture of a courtier, the gleam of a weapon, the softness of a garden scene. These paintings are not only art, they are political theater showing the empire as refined, orderly, and abundant. Architecture becomes one of the Mughal Empire's most enduring signatures. Under Akbar, monumental buildings blend Persianate and Indian elements, arches and domes alongside carved pillars and bracketed forms. Under his successors, especially Jahangir and Shah Jahan, Mughal architecture reaches a peak of elegance, white marble, intricate inlay symmetry that feels almost like music made visible. The Taj Mahal, built by Shah Jahan in memory of his wife Mumtaz Mahal, stands as the most famous emblem of this aesthetic. It is often described as a monument of love, but it is also a monument of empire, the ability to command resources, artisans, and time itself into a single luminous form. When you stand before it in imagination at dawn, when the marble catches pale light and seems to glow from within, you can feel how Mughal power sought to present itself not as brute dominance alone, but as a kind of timeless beauty. Yet behind the marble and gardens, the empire remains human and therefore fragile. Jahangir's reign is marked by court politics and the growing influence of powerful families, including figures like Nur Jahan, who becomes one of the most significant women in Mughal political life. Her presence reminds us that empire is not only about kings, it is about households, alliances, and the subtle power of access to the ruler. And then, as the empire expands, it also stretches. Under Aurangzeb, the Mughal realm reaches its greatest territorial extent, pushing deep into the Deccan. But expansion has a cost. Long campaigns drain resources. Managing distant provinces strains administration. Regional elites resist, and local powers, most notably the Marathas, under leaders like Shivaji and his successors, begin to challenge Mughal authority with remarkable persistence. Aurangzeb's religious policies are often remembered as more orthodox and less accommodating than Akbar's. The reality is complex, shaped by politics as much as conviction. But what matters for the historical arc is that tensions increase between the center and regions, between imperial demands and local autonomy, among diverse communities negotiating their place within the empire. Even during these strains, Mughal India remains economically vibrant. Indian textiles, especially cotton cloth, are prized across global markets. Trade continues through ports and inland routes. Cities like Agra, Lahore, and Delhi remain major centers of wealth and culture. The empire is not simply a court. It is a vast economic world where merchants, artisans, peasants, and soldiers all participate in the rhythms of production and exchange. And in the religious cultural sphere, India continues to create new syntheses. The Sikh tradition emerges in the Punjab, beginning with Guru Nanak in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, emphasizing devotion, ethical living, and community. Over time, Sikh institutions grow stronger and more organized, interacting with Mughal authority in complex ways that include both cooperation and conflict. Bhakti movements continue to flourish in many regions, producing poets and saints whose songs remain central to Indian devotional life. Sufi orders continue their own influence, creating networks of spirituality and culture that cross social boundaries. So the Mughal moment is both a peak and a turning. It is a peak of imperial integration, artistic refinement, and global economic significance. But it also contains within it the beginnings of fragmentation, because the empire's very size makes it hard to hold, because new regional powers grow stronger, because the costs of war and administration accumulate, and because global currents are shifting in ways the Mughals cannot fully control. By the early 18th century, after Aurangzeb's long reign ends, Mughal central authority weakens. Succession struggles intensify. Provincial governors become more independent. The once shining imperial center begins to look less like a garden and more like a courtyard exposed to wind. And into this opening step new forces, regional states like the Marathas, the Nizam of Hyderabad, the Nawabs of Bengal and Awadh and others, each building their own power. At the same time, European trading companies, once content to be merchants at Indian ports, begin to act with increasing political ambition. Their ships bring not only goods but cannon treaties and a different kind of empire. As dusk settles over a Mughal garden, the fountains still run and the paths still hold their symmetry. But beyond the walls, the world is changing. The monsoon winds still return each year faithful as ever, and the rivers still carry silt to the plains. Yet the political currents are turning, drawing India toward an age of colonial dominance, resistance, and finally the long struggle to become a nation-state. Empire to nation, Twilight, Partition, and living legacy. The older empires of India, Maurya and Gupta, Chola, Mughal, rise like mountains in the imagination, and then as the centuries pass, they soften into hills and finally into outlines. But the land remains. The rivers keep moving. The monsoon still returns with its patient seasonal certainty. And in the long 18th century, as Mughal authority thins and regional powers compete for space, a different kind of presence begins to take root along the coasts. Quiet at first, almost easy to overlook, like a ship's silhouette far out on the sea. European trading companies had been visiting Indian ports for centuries, buying textiles, spices, and other goods that made Indian craftsmanship famous across the world. At the beginning, they came as merchants, not kings. They built warehouses, negotiated permissions, paid customs, and learned the rhythms of Indian markets. But trade is never only trade. It draws power toward itself. It creates dependence, it invites protection, and then it invites control. In the 18th century, the balance shifts. The Mughal center weakens further, and regional states, rich, ambitious, and often militarily capable, compete in a landscape where alliances are fragile. Into this competitive field, the British East India Company begins to act not merely as a buyer of goods, but as a political force. It raises armies. It intervenes in succession disputes. It signs treaties that steadily convert influence into authority. The transformation is gradual, and that is part of its strength. A merchant does not need to announce conquest in the same way an emperor does. A merchant can claim to be protecting trade, ensuring stability, maintaining agreements until one day the agreements have become a net. In Bengal, after decisive conflicts in the mid-18th century, company power grows rapidly, and revenue from fertile lands becomes a fuel source for further expansion. What begins in one region spreads outward as other Indian powers, Marathas, Mysore, seek polities, princely states resist, negotiate, and sometimes succumb to a new system that combines diplomacy, military force, and economic extraction. For ordinary people, this new rule often feels less like a change of flag and more like a change of pressure. Land revenue systems are altered. Markets become tied to global demand. Certain crafts suffer as patterns of production shift, and imported goods compete with local manufacture. Famines driven by drought policy and the harsh logic of revenue leave deep scars. Railways and telegraphs appear in the 19th century, binding distances together with iron and wire, but they also serve the needs of administration and extraction. The state becomes more intrusive and more organized, and yet often less intimate, less rooted in local obligations of kingship and patronage, more focused on bureaucratic order. And still India's society does what it has always done. It adapts. Old institutions bend, new ones form. In 1857, a great rupture tears through northern and central India, an uprising that the British long called a mutiny, and that Indian memory often frames as a war of independence. Soldiers, dispossessed rulers, landlords, and ordinary people rise in different places for different reasons: anger at policies, fear of cultural disruption, resentment of foreign control, the shock of rapid change. The rebellion is widespread and fierce, and its suppression is brutal. Afterward, the British government takes direct control from the company, inaugurating what becomes known as the British Raj. The Raj tries to present itself as stable, rational, and permanent. It builds grand government buildings, codifies laws, expands railways, and cultivates an image of order. Yet it is an order that rests on inequality political power, concentrated in foreign hands, economic decisions shaped by imperial interest, and social life increasingly influenced by colonial categories and assumptions. At the same time, the 19th century is also an age of Indian intellectual and social reform. In different regions, thinkers, religious leaders, and activists respond to colonial rule and to internal social questions. Some seek to revive and reinterpret older traditions. Others advocate reforms in education, caste practices, and the status of women. Still others imagine new forms of religious and national identity. English education creates a new class of Indians fluent in the language of modern law, political theory, and global debate, often used first to argue within the colonial system, and later to challenge it more directly. Out of this ferment grows Indian nationalism, not as a single voice, but as a chorus of many voices. In 1885, the Indian National Congress is founded initially as a forum for petition and political discussion among educated elites. Over time, it becomes one of the main vehicles for the independence movement. The early struggle includes constitutional demands, protests, and debates about the best path forward: cooperation reform or direct resistance. Alongside Congress, other political currents develop, including the Muslim League, founded in 1906, reflecting the concerns of many Muslims about representation rights and political safeguards in a future where numbers and identity could become sources of vulnerability. The early 20th century brings sharper confrontations. The partition of Bengal in 1905, later reversed, becomes a symbol of how administrative decisions can cut into the fabric of community and identity. World War I draws India into global conflict with enormous contributions of soldiers and resources, and in its aftermath, expectations of political reform rise only to be met with continued imperial control and moments of harsh repression. Then comes a figure whose presence changes the tone of the struggle: Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi's power is not in armies or wealth, but in moral imagination. He advocates nonviolent resistance, satyagraha, the force of truth turning protest into a form of disciplined spiritual and political practice. He speaks of self-rule, not only as the replacement of foreign officials with Indian officials, but as a transformation of society. Simpler living, local industry, communal harmony, and the refusal to cooperate with injustice. In the 1920s and 1930s, the independence movement becomes mass politics. People who had never read a political pamphlet still understand the symbolism of salt cloth and refusal. The Salt March, the boycott of foreign goods, the spinning wheel, these become ways of saying, quietly but powerfully, that authority is not inevitable. Across India, leaders and organizers mobilize workers, peasants, students, and women, building networks of protest and aspiration that touch village and city alike. Yet as the movement grows, so do its tensions. India is vast, and its communities are many. The question of how power will be shared in an independent future becomes urgent. Hindu-Muslim relations shaped by centuries of coexistence and conflict, and now sharpened by colonial politics and modern fears, become increasingly strained in the 1940s. Leaders argue over federal structures, minority protections, and the nature of representation. The demand for Pakistan, an independent homeland for Muslims in certain regions, gains strength driven by political calculation, genuine anxieties, and the sense that trust has frayed too far. World War II accelerates everything. India again becomes a crucial part of a global conflict. The strain is immense, and the desire for independence intensifies. By the mid-1940s, British resolve to maintain the Raj weakens, and the momentum toward freedom becomes unstoppable. In 1947, independence arrives, but it arrives hand in hand with partition. The subcontinent is divided into India and Pakistan, and the division is accompanied by one of the largest and most painful mass migrations in modern history. People who had lived side by side for generations are suddenly told they are on the wrong side of a line. Trains fill with families carrying what they can. Villages empty. New arrivals crowd into unfamiliar cities. Violence erupts in many places, leaving grief that is difficult to measure. Independence brings joy and relief, but also trauma, because the birth of nations is not always gentle. And still, out of this upheaval, India builds. In 1950, India adopts a constitution that frames the country as a sovereign democratic republic committed to justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. It is a remarkable achievement, a vast, diverse population choosing electoral democracy and constitutional governance, attempting to hold together differences of language, religion, region, and caste within a single political framework. The years that follow are filled with challenges: poverty, development, communal tensions, wars with neighboring states, political upheavals, and the sheer difficulty of governing a country of continental scale. Yet the democratic experiment persists, reshaping itself through elections, movements, and debate. Modern India becomes many things at once: a place of ancient pilgrimage routes and modern technology hubs of village fields, and crowded megacities of classical music and new cinema, of old inequalities and persistent struggles to overcome them. The legacy of the past is everywhere, not as a museum piece, but as living material. Temples and mosques, languages and epics, philosophies and festivals all continue to evolve. The past is not behind India like a closed door. It is around it, inside it, woven into its daily life. If you look back across the full span of this story, the most enduring pattern is not simply the rise and fall of empires. It is continuity through change. India is a land where multiple truths can coexist: conquest and devotion, argument, and song suffering and renewal. It absorbs what arrives, reshapes it, and carries forward sometimes wounded, sometimes radiant, always moving. And now, as the night settles again over the subcontinent, you can imagine the lights of countless homes, some in mountain villages where the air is thin and cold, some in coastal towns where the sea breathes against the shore, some in cities where traffic hums even after midnight. Somewhere a student reads beneath a lamp. Somewhere a family tells a story whose roots reach back into the oldest epics. Somewhere a train crosses a river that has been crossed by travelers for thousands of years. The centuries have been crowded with kings and rebels, poets and saints, merchants and farmers. So many lives, each one brief, each one carrying a small flame of meaning through the larger winds of history. And as those winds soften in the quiet hours before sleep, the land remains what it has always been, river and monsoon mountain, and plain a vast tapestry of memory and becoming. Let the story rest there gently, as if the last page has been turned not with a snap, but with a slow hand, and the room has grown dim. Outside, time continues steady as water in a dark river carrying India onward, as it always has, into another dawn.